Swords, the weapon of heroes. The sword is perhaps one of the most easily identifiable weapons throughout history. Nearly every single culture has had its own version of a sword in one way or another. But the sword's popularity has also been its biggest disservice. With as much attention as swords get, there is equal attention to misconceptions and myths about swords of all different shapes and sizes. So today, let's talk about 5 very popular myths that you hear really often about swords. Number 1, the katana is a super weapon that can cut through solid steel thanks to its thousands of folds. An argument made popular by anime and online forums. The katana is just simply not the strongest sword in existence because there is no such thing. The process of folding steel is not something that gives the katana some type of super steel or super metal that makes it much more effective at being a sword than any other type of sword. Rather, the iron deposits of Japan were racked with impurities that needed to be hammered out during the forging process. And the process of folding steel is one method that gets those impurities out of the metal. As the steel is hammered and folded, the impurities rise to the top, and also the steel becomes much more layered and uniform in its atomic structure, which adds to the durability of the steel itself. But steel is steel. It does not make it some sort of super metal. You will often hear that the katana has the strongest cutting edge of any sword. It does not have the strongest cutting edge. The strength of the katana is not its defining characteristic, but the hardness of the katana is its defining characteristic. The trade-off with hardness and strength is that the more hard a material gets, the more brittle it becomes. Both hardness and strength are something that you want for a sword. You want it to have a very hard cutting edge because that will mean the sword will be able to stay sharper for longer. But you also want this sword to bend and not break. You want it to be able to absorb a lot of punishment. But these two design qualities are opposites of each other. If you increase the hardness, you sometimes decrease its strength because you make it more brittle. The katana solves this problem by having a very hard steel wrapped around a softer steel. The hard steel has a high carbon content and the softer steel has a lower carbon content. In addition to this, katanas were often differentially heated and differentially hardened. The goal of this was to make a very, very hard cutting edge that could hold an edge very easily and would not chip and would not get dented over time. It would maintain its sharpness. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the katana is sharper than other swords. You can sharpen anything. You can sharpen paper. You can sharpen wood. So the process of folding steel was simply how you got a pure steel in the first place and got rid of those impurities. And the process of differential hardening was just the process of combating this strength versus hardness problem that you have in swords. Steel is steel, and the katana was a very effective weapon. It is still a marvel of engineering at solving this hardness versus strength problem, but it's not a super weapon. Number 2, European longswords are heavy and clunky. Most sword nerds are driven mad by the weight values that are assigned to certain swords in video games. Or sometimes how video games and movies can make these swords seem so clunky and just heavy. This is an Oakshott Type 15 longsword. It weighs 3 pounds, 5 ounces. Or for you people that use kilograms, that is 1.5 kilograms. And what's much more important than how much it weighs is where the center of mass is. Here, the center of mass of this sword is approximately 2.5 inches away from my hand, meaning that this sword actually feels very light and nimble in my hand. It feels like that I can control this very well. So not only is this sword light, it feels light. Myth number 3, the European longsword is superior to the Japanese katana. This argument is usually born out of people becoming disillusioned with the katana, but the problem is that the pendulum has swung way too far to the other side. Again, steel is steel, and there is nothing inherent in the European longsword that makes it a superior sword to the katana. Often for this argument, people will cite the process of spring tempering a European sword. Spring tempering is the way that many European swords solve the hardness versus strength problem. The process of tempering something is when you heat it, quench it, which makes the sword very hard. After it has been heated and quenched, it will be reheated again, but to a lesser degree, and then be allowed to air cool. This alleviates some of the tension in the sword and allows it to gain its characteristic of springiness. You can bend this sword and it will spring back to its original shape, thus spring tempering. But just like with the katana, that doesn't make this sword a super weapon. It doesn't make this sword indestructible. All swords are metal. All swords can and will break if they are used for long enough. When all is said and done, this is a steel sword, and it's a good steel sword. The katana is also a steel sword, and it's a good steel sword. Both of them excelled at what they did. And there is nothing about this sword's design or its manufacture that makes it superior to the katana. Myth number 4, the blood groove. This one absolutely drives me insane, because I don't know how anybody can look at the sword and think, yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes you will hear this little indented part on this sword being referred to as a blood groove. And when someone says that, they are usually saying that what this is designed for is to allow blood to flow through it into the sword, to drain the blood, to somehow facilitate a thrust with the sword.
Terrible weapon, the Gladius Hispaniensis. Didn't have any blood runnels, so there's no way for the air to come out of a wound and no way for the blood to run out of a wound either. So therefore, when the sword went in, it was very difficult to take out. So you had to give it a massive twist.
Now, problem number 1 with that is that it makes absolutely no sense, because swords with a center ridge rather than having any indentation have been used for all time. This is not a blood groove. It is called a fuller. And the fuller on the sword exists for really only one purpose, and that is to take mass out of the blade to make it lighter. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, first, let's think about the fact that when we're making a sword, we have a limited amount of material that we can use before the sword starts to get unreasonably heavy. And we also want to be strategic about where we're placing the mass of the metal on the sword. Typically speaking, the more mass that you have at the point of contact, the harder your sword is going to hit. Think about a sledgehammer or an axe. All of that mass is concentrated at the location of its hit so that you can get the most out of your impact with it. Now, many swords are both cut and thrust weapons, but a fuller is often an indication that the sword is tailored towards being more cut-oriented because it allows it to be wider for longer. Because you are taking mass out of the blade, which frees you up to put it elsewhere on the sword. Fullers come in many different shapes and sizes, and sometimes the fuller can tell you a little bit about the sword. For example, this is an Oakshott Type 13. Now, one of the characteristics about this sword is that the fuller only goes halfway up the blade. Why is that? The fuller doesn't continue to extend all the way through the length of the blade because this sword, more so than many others like it, is a very cut-oriented weapon, and we want to have a lot of mass in this portion where we are likely to hit someone with the sword. Because of that, the fuller takes some material out of the sword, but only up to halfway up the blade. So remember, it's not a blood groove, it's a fuller. Myth number 5, only the rich had swords in history. Now this one is a little bit hard to talk about because this is one that will vary a lot with place and time. But one period in particular that people really like to contrast is the Renaissance versus the Middle Ages. They will say in the Middle Ages, only the rich were able to afford and own swords and use them in battle. But by the time we get to the Renaissance, we get to the rapier, which becomes a civilian weapon. And everybody pretty much can afford a sword. This actually does sound and feel sort of correct because it has a nugget of truth in it. As metallurgy progresses, sword making becomes easier, and thus swords become more affordable and more commonplace. But that also doesn't mean that only the rich own swords. Perhaps only the rich owned the best swords. But even in the High Middle Ages, sword ownership was actually something that was legally required for peasants. One example actually comes from an English assize called the Assize of Arms in 1181, which required a certain amount of weapons or arms ownership depending upon a person's social status. And it actually does require certain free lay people and certain tradesmen to own swords. And part of the reasoning behind this is that in the Middle Ages, we don't really have a formal police force. A lot of the policing of local communities came from the communities themselves, and they were required to defend themselves in times of trouble. And at least by the late Middle Ages, we know that many of the common foot soldiers would have swords as a backup weapon. Further, judicial duels or trial by combat was often fought between peasants. In some places like England and Germany, the normal mode of combat was a sword and shield, and that included when peasants fought. Now, sometimes that weaponry was supplied by the court, but it sometimes didn't have to be. Now, this is another thing that we shouldn't go too far with. If you were rich, you were much more likely to own a sword than if you were poor. But that doesn't mean that only the rich owned swords, especially during the early and high Middle Ages. There were people who were less well off than the most wealthy in the land who still could afford and still did own swords. Now, we need to be careful to distinguish between sword ownership and sword carry. Those are two entirely different things, and the legality of that is vastly different. We're talking about sword ownership, not sword carry. That's its own thing for another video entirely. And those are 5 sword myths that drive me nuts. I am going to do more of these because there are oh so many more myths. So if there are any more myths that you would like to hear about that you know of, put it in the comments below and I will see you all next time.